Hey everybody, welcome back to the Live Ultralight podcast. Today we've got a golden nugget of an episode is what I'm going to call it. A shortcut, if you will, that will really help you in the outdoors. If you're just new turning into this podcast, this is the Live Ultralight podcast. It's powered by Outdoor Vitals. And it's all about getting you outdoors, showing you how to lighten your pack and build your confidence so you can start living your life full of adventure. And I would say that this particular one is going to really, really help solidify that. There's going to be a lot of takeaways. There's going to be a lot of learning opportunities and shortcuts there. But it's not just about that for us. I mean, for us here at Outdoor Vitals, our goal is not just to get you out on trail, but it's more of why we get you out on trail that is important. We just firmly believe that it will improve your lives physically, emotionally, mentally. And it's kind of weird to tie that into the gear itself, but it really is a factor because of where it can put you. So the topic of this episode is going to be about a 10-piece layering system guide that Brigham wrote. Now, this guide is it's big. It's pretty massive. You can find it on our website at Outdoor Vitals. I think written out in a doc form. It was 36 pages long, so it's very comprehensive. But what is interesting, I think, for you guys is as we go through this and as we outline the highlights here that will help you have the right layering system, it should empower you to get outdoors more often. And a lot of times the most beneficial experiences I've had outdoors have been when the weather's not good, when things get a little bit crazy, but I've still been comfortable and been able to enjoy it because of principles like we're going to be talking about in this podcast. So with that introduction, Brigham, do you have anything to add about why this might be a particular podcast of importance for people?
I think, I don't know, the word foundational is maybe, I don't know. I hate to have that sound a little too significant or too, I don't know, sensational, but I think understanding a little bit of behind the why in our clothing choices for when we go outside can be really helpful. We don't want to just have an infinite number of clothing choices or clothing items in our gear closet or whatever. And so having some understanding a little bit about some the right way to make certain choices or a good way to make certain choices with clothing can help us to kind of just slim everything down and simplify our thought process or our packing process and help us enjoy the actual time that we have getting out there.
Yeah, I think there's some fallacies or false beliefs out there that I came into this world with of just bulk means warmth or the more layers, the warmer you're going to be, and really more does not always mean more. A lot of times the more means less when it comes to layering. And so by understanding some of this guide, it really can streamline your system, streamline your pack. And I really was pondering that a lot as I was out on the trail this fall as the temperature started to dip and change. I was just thinking about the layering system that I use, which will be founded in everything we're going to be talking about today. But man, I take so much less stuff. I'm warmer on trail than I typically ever have been. And when I'm not warm, I understand the why and I can adapt something to change that out. And I look back at years of trial and effort and energy, and I look at this type of information as just a massive shortcut. A lot of experiences that could have gone better. You could have been warmer, could have been more comfortable. If just would have started looking at systems like this a little bit earlier on and had the knowledge of knowing when to use these pieces of gear as well. So I think we teed it up here pretty good, Brigham.
Pretty good point. I would agree. I think I'm actually I'm not a big believer in shortcuts because I think they stay with us for a shorter amount of time. Whatever gains we get from a shortcut, I think are a little bit fleeting. But I do think if kind of applying the thought process of this whole thing, I think it just maybe speeds up the process, which is a shortcut. But I think it's one area that doesn't necessarily it's not the same as experience shortcuts of like just having experience of doing things. I think it can just get us in a right place and a safe place, because it'll enable us to, just get out into the backcountry and spend more time outdoors. And that's where the experience for every individual will reinforce their clothing choices. So it's a shortcut on like the context and the why, but it's just shortcuts them to get outside faster. And then they can, start experiencing their own lessons learned from their clothing choices.
Yeah, I think we're going to be talking about high-level principles, right, within layering. What's the purpose of a layering system? Why do we even call it a system? Like, what's the point of it being a system? We're going to talk about, like, the categories within that system. But what we're not going to talk about is, like, the specifics of buy this exact piece of gear, right? Because that's where they can build their own preferences. They can build their own trial and error.
Right.
But these are more like principles that are pretty foundational and I would say just true, right? That's typically what a principle is more just a truth or a matter of fact type of a statement. But then the nuances you guys will be able to dial in on your own experience in the field, and we'll hopefully be able to give you or point you in the right direction with that. So on that note, Brigham, why call this a system? Why is it important that we have a system for layering instead of just grab and go with your gear?
One, because it's founded on like certain understanding of what clothing should do. And then when you have that understanding, it simplifies the decision-making process and like in packing for whatever the trip is. Because really clothing in a performance setting or where your clothing is kind of part of your survival system that keeps you active in the backcountry. Kind of lost my train of thought there. That's embarrassing. But
I was thinking 2 steps ahead too, so I can't even catch you.
I mean, let's just go back to your question. Why the system? Why the system? Once you understand the context, it simplifies the packing process because you understand what your clothing is supposed to do. And then you can look at the clothing that you have and understand if it accomplishes what it's supposed to do or how it accomplishes what it's supposed to do and how that will benefit you or us, the users, in the backcountry. So how it just kind of sets up some parameters and things for us to like maybe close some loops or gaps or connect some dots.
Yeah. I think the older I get, the more I realize the value in a system or a checklist. You've probably heard me speak a ton about checklists on the podcast. The thing about the checklist that we've talked about so far has just been like, this is what I'm taking, not necessarily the principles behind it. But it does make me kind of question here, Brigham. So we've got this labeled as a 10-piece system, right?
Yeah.
Does that mean that you're taking 10 pieces out on trail on every trip?
No, it kind of just ends up being about 10 pieces. And that is basically if you have this, I call it a curated collection of 10 pieces kind of means that there's a lot of thought and deliberation that goes into it. So if you have, basically if you've got these 10 pieces covered, you've basically got like the right tools in your toolbox for pretty much any trip year round. To where, let's say you're planning a trip in July in like the high country, like, way up in Colorado, where weather's probably going to be like as mild as it's going to get, like in terms of warm temperatures, but there's going to be tons of mosquitoes. So like there's certain clothing pieces in this 10-piece system that will help you like stay cool, but also help you with the bug situation. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of just ends up being what I feel is like a really good number to have. I think all your bases covered for basically year-round backpacking.
Yeah, I think a part of this system is it can build over time. If you're going to do a specific trip, you may acquire a piece or two to be able to do that trip. Well, those can stay with you, and some of those pieces, a lot of them actually, if you get the right pieces, can be used year round, but it'll just kind of build over time, and it's not like an upfront expense of like, oh man, I need to go out and buy these 10 different pieces in order to backpack correctly. No, that's really not what this is about, because a lot of what we'll talk about is just the application of those pieces too. So, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, that's a great point, because you kind of want to just end up here. You want to get to the point where, like, once you've got about these 10 pieces, like, you're pretty well set, and you can it's a menu really. You select for the given conditions or the expected conditions of any given trip, and knowing that they're going to fulfill their purpose and do their job, so that, like, we can just enjoy our time out there with confidence.
It's pretty freeing to look at this, and I think the promise that we're saying is with this 10-piece system, you really wouldn't have to go out of your way to do anything in the area, the geological area that you've been using it in. So, for instance, like, we're in Utah. We've got everything from super hot summer desert conditions to winter conditions at 12,000 feet. But as I look down this list, it's like, yeah, this 10 pieces will, like, allow me to backpack year round in this climate. Now, that's probably not going to be true if I was to, like, try to go to Antarctica all of a sudden. Like, I'm probably going to need some specialty pieces for that. But with 10 pieces, like, I've got a year round kit that just, like, it's pretty freeing to just know, like, I've got it, the bases covered. So,
yeah.
All right, I think we've teed this up quite a bit. Let's continue into, I don't know what you call these. You've got 3 points here about, like, the purpose of clothing, or the purpose
kind of three main goals that we need to accomplish with our clothing. Which would be maintain and regulate our body temperature, which is, I mean, that's one of the three main reasons for clothing, is to preserve our body temperature. We're warm-blooded mammals, and our body temperature needs to be very close to 98.6 degrees. But being warm-blooded, that means we generate and emit heat, and so we have to manage and just maintain a healthy body temperature. We need to protect our bodies from external or superficial or surface harm, from infection, from insects, from the sun, from heat depleting precipitation. And so, yeah, and then, like, we want our clothing should, like, keep us comfortable and just allow us to accomplish our trip, do the trip that we wanted to do, and have fun and enjoy our time safely.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you could sit in your sleeping bag all day and stay warm and comfortable, but you're not accomplishing, your trip or getting the performance out of your body that you need and whatnot. Right. So just to recap those, you've got basically maintain your core body temperature to protect our bodies. I like that, like, even from sun, right? Mm-hmm. And then to basically enable us to accomplish the task at hand.
Yeah.
And I think, being able to apply these, really does, I guess, enable us to accomplish all of those things. And I think that last one, though, of just, like, enabling is the key one, because if you do your system right, you'll feel more empowered to be able to do certain trips, right? Like, there's a lot of people that are seasonal backpackers. There's a lot of people that may only backpack in one climate and these types of things, and other trips are just off the table without having this system. So, all right, one other big step I wanted to talk about before we get into the pieces themselves is heat loss. This is, as I was talking earlier about, like, just my layering system and how it's adapted. And maybe I'll save some of this thought for later in the category section themselves. But I think as I understand these different ways that we lose heat more, the more, like, the layering system just makes a ton of sense. And I'll just, to go through these, right? You've got radiation, you've got evaporative cooling, you've got convective heat loss, and you've got conductive heat loss. These are all actually quite different ways that we would lose heat, right? So radiation is just, like, what's emitted, if I'm correct, and stop me if I'm wrong. Like, you're always putting off a little bit of heat, and so something like a puffy jacket could help trap that. Versus evaporative cooling, like sun hoodies, right? So if you're sweating, like, that's a mechanism for our bodies to cool themselves off. But sometimes a layering a piece can play into that with like I say, a sun hoodie, if it was wet, that can actually help you stay cooler. And then you've got convective heat loss. And this is one that stood out to me the most the last few months, because we've been testing. Well, one, we've been using the Tusher rain jacket, and that's one that basically will block the wind so that the wind isn't what I like to call it, is steal your heat. That's right. This category of convective heat loss is heat stealers, right? It's not just it's just like slowly coming off your body. It's not anything like that. It's just the wind or whatever it is just pushing the air, and it's just ripping the heat off of you. Yeah. Because in a lot of these scenarios, whether you're using, let's say it's a rain jacket as a shell to stop that air motion, or whether it's a windbreaker, the amount of heat that you can retain by just not allowing it to get stolen off of you so easy through air is crazy. And that's been I don't know, if putting that into words, I wish I could help people understand how important that is, because it's the difference of being able to hike in 3 layers of clothing and then be freezing somehow versus hike in a single rain jacket and be the right temperature and not get a bunch of other stuff wet with sweat
there's in everyday life, I think most people in the civilized world there's actually really good examples that we're surrounded by with right this second in our homes, and that are associated with convective heat loss. We want what convective heat loss. If air moves across, the movement of air across a body withdraws heat from the body. So in our homes, we use insulation between the walls and the exterior of the house to create dead air space. We want to eliminate the movement of air between two surfaces as much as possible. If our houses didn't have insulation, there's this 6 to 8 inch gap of sheetrock to, say, brick outside or stucco. That's all open air that still can move around, and that movement of air withdraws heat from the heat source. Same thing with our windows. Modern windows are vacuums. So they're 2 layers of glass that are manufactured where the air is actually sucked out of the window. So within those 2 sheets of glass, the air is dead. It cannot move. And that's deliberate. That's to eliminate the movement of air, because that movement of air will draw heat out of your kitchen. So it's the same thing. We're kind of accomplishing. We're just doing the same thing with clothing.
Right.
To prevent the convective heat loss.
And I would say that's one of the biggest misinterpretations too of how much clothing you need is related to getting this single point wrong, or not understanding, convective heat loss. Because you think about it, let's say you were to take someone out and you took them to a football game and they sat on the bleachers, and they're just sitting there and they're freezing, right? And they're like, man, I didn't have enough layers. I could have taken more blankets. I could have taken more jackets. But then you take that same person, you're like, hey, let's go walk around the block in the same, right after the football game. Let's just say, let's go for a little walk around the block. And their mentality is, well, I need every piece of clothing I can put on because I was cold already. Yeah. But just even the simple act of walking will generate a tremendous amount of heat, and suddenly they're going to be sweating in their clothing layering systems, and
they're going to
so on. Right. And so I think understanding these, that's just a great example, because really at that point, it's not so much about you need to generate and maintain all of the heat because you're losing it through radiation, but at that point you're over generating the amount of heat you need. So you just need it to not get ripped off your body too quickly, which is where a shell can come into play. So
right. I think that's kind of why the understanding the different ways of heat loss is really critical, because heat loss is necessary to a degree. Heat loss has to exist. It's a physical constant. If we as human beings did not radiate heat, we would die, because we have to release the heat. It's hypothetical. We can't, because we would.
When you break down bonds, there's heat created.
If you were to just say all of a sudden, me 98.6 degrees, I'm going to just flip a switch and now magically my body doesn't emit heat, you'd die really fast, because your body and your brain would overheat and you'd have heat stroke and you'd die. So heat loss, whether it's cold or hot, that's what you're trying to manage. So if it's hot, you're still trying to manage heat loss. If it's cold, you're still trying to manage heat loss. So that's why it's a really important thing to kind of to understand.
Yeah, and then the last point here on just the 4 different ways of heat loss is conductive heat loss, and that's actual like physical contact with something. I think about this a lot when I'm running like our camera in cold temperatures, and I'm like holding onto the tripod, like almost instantly. Like if you're grabbing like a piece of metal, like think about when you're going to put your steaks in the cold temperatures. Yeah. Your steaks are metal; they're super cold, and it just pulls the heat off. If you're to sit down on the ground, and the ground's cold, right? It's going to pull that heat off of you. Sleeping pads, kind of a scenario like that. We're trying to mitigate that conductive heat loss from actually laying on top of something. So, yeah, I think all of those are just really important to understand because all of them are going to have a slightly different remedy to solve when it comes to the layering system. So now, I mean, we set the stage. We're basically into the 10-piece layering system. Yeah. So let's talk about the 3 categories of them.
Okay. But so 2 sentences just to kind of go back in terms of context. Everything we're talking about is in the context of like backpacking or hiking or an active pursuit. We're not talking there are principles that apply. Understanding heat loss is important, but especially with what we're about to talk about, we're talking about like backpacking or just call it active pursuits in the backcountry where it is implied and assumed that there is going to be body movement. We're not talking about sitting on a lake ice fishing for 8 hours. Like that would drastically change certain choices. But this is where our body is like a component of the system because our body is going to generate and release more or less heat as activity level increases and decreases.
Yeah, that's not that sitting on an ice or an icy lake fishing, like the principles would be the same, but the layering system that we'll outline might not be adequate or tailored to that. Yeah. So within this 10-piece layering system, we've got what are called kinetic categories, protective categories, and static categories. Maybe explain those real quick.
Yeah, so it's again kind of going into the system where it's broken into the 3 collections that have categories within them, but the collections are just so you can kind of like, now that we've kind of talked about some of the behind or the understanding why, like kinetic, static, protective, they're broken down that way to help us just keep the processes in mind, but it also simplifies it. So like within the kinetic collection, those kinetic, that's that references movement and activity. So clothing that's going to be associated with us being active and on the move. And static is the opposite. Those are, stationary. That's clothing that is specific and has a specific application for when we are stationary and we're generating the least amount of heat that we will. And then protective is, to accomplish those goals of protecting our body from, topical harm of scrapes and scratches and insect bites and bacteria and the sun and, moisture. So heat robbing moisture and wind. So
I don't know if I like talking about the protective side. It makes it sound like so doom and gloom out there. You can get scratched and bit and burned by the sun. And okay, so let's dive through this. Obviously, starting with just base layers themselves. So in that kinetic category, the first thing you've got on the list here is a base layer top, short or long sleeve, crew tee or hoodie. With that specific piece, I think you maybe broken this in because again, I'm trying to build this into the Cliff Notes version of that. You've also got lightweight synthetic pants, lightweight synthetic shorts. So obviously in that scenario, you're probably taking one of those.
Yep.
And then you've got some others. So that's kind of the base. Let's stick with those 2 base layers. Let's say we're going to stick with just the base layer top and either a lightweight synthetic pant or a lightweight synthetic short. What are the purposes and principles behind those 2 pieces in a kinetic system?
Yeah, so understanding that it's kinetic, so we're going to be moving. So we're trying to account for conditions that our body is creating and account for the conditions that the environment has dropped on our lap. So with maintaining, managing, regulating body temperature with a base layer, whether that's That's always going to be our first next to skin layer. And its primary job is to move moisture away from our body. That comes into play whether it's cold or hot. If it's hot, we want that to occur because that is going to facilitate the evaporative cooling heat loss process, which we want. That's what we want. When it's really cold, and especially really cold and windy, we want to get moisture away from our bodies and pushed out away from our bodies as quickly as possible so that we're not having our heat stolen away from us by the wind from convective heat loss or excessive evaporative cooling. So base layer, that long sleeve or short sleeve, that top, that is also in warm weather, oftentimes our standalone hiking shirt, call it the hiking shirt. And so as we go through this, we'll notice that there's a lot of versatility and crossover and multi-purpose application of a lot of these pieces, and that is intentional. Like that's deliberate. We want this piece to be as versatile and adaptive as possible.
Yeah, I think the Cliff Notes version of base layers, that's the top, a pair of pants or a pair of shorts, is just moisture management. You're not trying to get, you're not trying to block anything. Like you're not trying to maintain radiation heat. You're not trying to completely eliminate evaporative cooling. You're not trying to do any of these things. But really, by allowing your body to facilitate what it's got built in to do already, which is, facilitate it sweating properly and controlling that. And then, there's tiny benefits in like radiation heat loss, but that's not where you're going to get your biggest gains. So really, to me, it's use this one as a moisture management. That doesn't. We're not going to get into the specifics around like, synthetic versus a merino wool versus those things. But when you are shopping for this, just know you want it to be something that can dry very quickly and manage moisture very effectively. So that's 3 parts right there. Just the top, either a pair of pants or a pair of shorts. The next 2 in the kinetic category here is a base layer bottom. So that's a synthetic or merino leggings or long johns, and an active insulation. This is for the top. This would be like a fleece or a breathable lofted insulation. I imagine that would be like the Ventus is what you're thinking of there, like our Ventus active hoodie, or a hybrid version of that. So what is the point? This is still a kinetic or an active piece, but talk through kind of what you're looking for with this part of the layering system.
Yeah, so the first one was the leggings, so that's essentially you want it to do the same thing as your base layer top. When people choose to use the leggings under a pair of pants varies very much between person to person. Like there are some people like me that, man, I very rarely will put base layer bottoms on under a pair of pants just because my lower half is very warm. But there are people that
that's like an understatement. I don't know. I often ask Brigham, about this, and he never ever has a layer on his bottom half, unless it's basically for sleeping, or he knows he's going to be sitting stagnant for a long time. Yeah. Whereas like myself, in these cold conditions, I might put on something like a dragon wool bottom. Yeah. That one's probably the warmest one I'd ever try to hike in. So I have some other ones too, just always doing R&D that I've liked as well. But definitely you want to think of this as a very light piece if you're going to be active in it. But you never.
I never do. I never do.
That's not how everyone is. That's just how Brigham is.
No, and that's why I say there's a very broad use or application from person to person. But in the end, you want it to do the same thing as your base layer tops. For the people that need to put on a pair of leggings under pants, but they still need to move. So they need to be breathable. They need to get moisture off the skin. And then, so there's the principles are the same for the leggings. And then moving on to the active insulation, again, it's something that we want to keep our bodies warm enough that we can keep doing the activity that we're doing without overheating. So it's a kinetic, it's an active piece, but the kind of the function, how it goes about keeping us warm and how warm we need it to keep our bodies changes between this and say like something in the static collection or a more lofted static piece. So, you know, in active insulation, there's different types, and they all have their pros and cons or their benefits or what they do better at, you know, whether it comes to breathability or wind resistance. And so when it's, you know, really, really cold, and just hiking in your base layer hoodie is not going to cut it. But it's say the wind is pretty dead. It's really helpful to have like some kind of active insulation on that you can just start the hike in and just hike for hours in without having to take it off, because it's going to breathe and wick moisture and dry quickly. But it's going to give you, it's kind of just gives you just enough of a boost in heat.
Yeah. So again, something like that's going to be like a fleece piece, something that has a little bit of loft to it, essentially. The Ventus active hoodie is one that's going to do something like that. That's just going to give you that light boost in temperature. But here, I mean, for this one too, it's you're just trying to mitigate some of these things, take the edge off some of these things. Yep. You're trying to, you know, reduce radiation heat loss just a little bit. You're trying to reduce, I wouldn't say you're maybe not evaporative cooling quite as much, but convective heat loss. You're trying to reduce that just a little bit. Those two primarily. In this scenario, I would say it starts to turn from a little bit for the application of these. It turns from, you're not necessarily trying to like keep your heat from getting stolen, but just not get it like dispersed too quickly, in my mind. So. Yeah. But yeah, it is pretty critical, because there are definitely times when it can get cold out. I mean, a lot of the times when I'm actually needing to do these, it's snow conditions. Yeah. When you're actually being active and you still need another layer on top of you for like a lofted style layer, like a fleece, you're in pretty dang cold conditions. Yeah. So keep that in mind with this particular piece. And those are all of the active pieces before we get into the protective pieces that can or cannot be used depending on your conditions when you're being active or static. So protective pieces here, we've got waterproof breathable rain jacket, waterproof breathable rain pants, and a lightweight windbreaker. So I'll let you decide how you want to tackle these categories here.
Well, I mean, the purpose, the goals we're trying to accomplish with these pieces, they're still the same. We still have to manage our body temperature. We still are trying to protect our body, and we're assuming we still want to be out in the mountains or wherever we are, the desert, or, you know, like we still want to go through with our adventure. But when conditions call for it, you know, if it starts raining or snowing, you know, we need to keep the water from contacting our skin. We want to keep our skin as dry as possible. So we're trying to protect our body from, you know, a lot of the convective heat loss, you know, and like we're basically we're trying to stay dry to stay warm. So we're protecting our body from the precip that's coming down. It does, you know, in terms of the waterproof breathable stuff, it's for sure going to block the wind. Like, you know, it's protecting us from, you know, the wind sucking the heat away. But depending on the conditions, we're going to choose one piece over the other. So the other piece was like a really lightweight windbreaker. The windbreaker has can give an incredible boost to like just the right boost across a wide range of temperatures. I don't know.
Very well said.
That was not very well said. But the windbreaker basically, you know, we want to use a windbreaker way more often than we want to use our rain jacket, because the windbreaker is going to breathe a lot better, but it's going to block enough of the wind that we can just keep going. One of the other like core principles of this whole thing is efficiency. Like, we don't want to be stopping, you know, every 20 minutes to change a layer. We want to be able to go as long as possible without stopping.
When you are stopping to change that layer, eventually you quit stopping to change layers, and you get yourself into trouble down the road too. You either start sweating and you build up all this sweat, or maybe you get too cold on the other end of that. But like the way that you typically will talk about a windbreaker is basically you'll say something along the lines of like, there's almost nothing that can provide this much more comfort or warmth that weighs this little.
Yeah, across the broadest use case. Like it's really interesting when you look at it. You get this 4-ounce windbreaker that you can use in the summertime, but you can also use in the wintertime kind of to do the same thing, but just in different temperature ranges and different exertion levels. It's a little bit underutilized or a little bit underrepresented, but if it's a great piece because oftentimes most people will have a rain jacket, and when it's really windy, that's the piece that they have. That's going to block the wind. It'll block the wind, but it'll also not breathe nearly as well as we want because then we're overheating. We're getting too hot. We're sweating inside. So now we're losing a bunch of body moisture, which means we have to filter more water, drink more water. We're using more resources. It's wearing us down. Whereas like with the windbreaker, it's just this really light piece that just has a lot of application.
Yeah, it can just stop so much evaporative cooling from happening, and just allow you to just retain just that edge, right? Because anytime you're hiking or moving, like you are generating a higher degree of heat for sure. You're consuming more food. You're breaking more bonds apart in your stomach. Whatever. It's producing this heat, and just that slight edge. I think people would be incredibly surprised by.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to share, I guess, even just to mix this up a little bit, just examples of this, because obviously, like the idea behind protectiveness is to keep yourself dry. And it's funny how much stuff just comes back to moisture management in a layering system, whether it's your base layers getting rid of it or your lack of wanting to trap it in. But one of the things that I see happen the most, or the things that get done wrong the most often, are people that start hiking in some kind of a piece, let's just call it a rain jacket, that is not going to breathe enough. And as soon as they start moving, even just a little bit, you'll start to generate enough heat, and pretty soon you'll be sweating before you know it.
Yeah.
And I had a scenario as a kid that I had a jacket that I didn't even really realize it was quote unquote a hard shell or had a rain protective layer in it. I knew, but I didn't think of it that way. And anyways, we hiked into this area, and when we got there, we stopped for a little over an hour in one place, and I could not warm up. I was putting on every layer of clothes I had, which really was pretty much everything I hiked in. And I was so cold. I was like shivering. I felt like almost hypothermic. And really, in retrospect, all of that was done because I hiked in too many clothes, started to develop sweat. And then when you get that moisture trapped inside of your layers, I can't even explain why or how it does this to this degree, but it is like an ice box inside. It's almost like it's holding in the cold rather than holding in the heat at that point. You just get all that moisture, starts to go cold. Your body can't keep the temperature of that moisture. And now it's got to take the time to either dry those pieces out or something along those lines. And so this protective one is one where a big balance to me comes into play, because when you understand this one, you have the biggest gains with I would say weight and efficiency. By understanding, hey, like earlier this fall, I was hiking. It was about 32 degrees out, probably 30 degrees out. It had just hailed. Basically, all this hail was still all over, so it looked like it had snowed. My breath was freezing. I mean, the second it was coming out of my mouth, it was really bugging me because I had to hike for about 2 hours, and I couldn't see anything because every time I breathe, it was just coming right in my face because hiking with the wind.
Oh, nice.
And it was killing me. But the crazy thing is I'm hiking in the dark for 2 hours in freezing temperatures, and all I wore was a base layer and our Tusher rain jacket. And I was completely fine. And this same principle applies to gloves. So I was also only wearing a shell glove, not an insulative glove, not a lofted or basically, I was just wearing a shell just to stop the heat from getting pulled off me too quickly. And what I liked about that is when I got to camp, yes, my base layer was a little bit moist, but I only had one layer on. And me personally, part of what I like to do is I'll typically have two base layers or I'll have a sleeping layer. So I switch on my sleeping layer, which we'll talk about here in a second. And now I've got a dry base layer against my skin. I instantly, can get my temperature exactly where I want it. I don't have to like dry clothing out. I don't have to do any of that. But by essentially understanding how to utilize these protective layers to minimize your heat loss, you can get away with way, way, way less total layers brought, right?
Yeah, for sure. And you can get away with not having to change layers so much. You can just go after it, get after it and stay moving for a lot longer rather than stopping and changing. And like, that's the worst. Like, to me, that's like, I'm that way with the backpack. You guys joke about like, I do not like to stop and take my backpack off. Mm-hmm. So like, I'm the same way with layers. Like, just don't want to do it. So that's why I
feel like there's a philosophy out there of like how they say it, like if you don't start hiking cold, then you're doing it wrong or something like that. It's kind of like
because I mean, if it's uncomfortable to start wearing like dressed appropriately, but if you can just get past the first 5 minutes, like you'll be good for another 2 hours versus like starting out, comfortable standing still. And then in 5 minutes, everybody does the same thing. Well, I've only been walking for 5 minutes. I'm not going to stop and take off my coat. But then they try to push it another half hour or whatever. And sooner or later, they're overheated. They're drenched inside. Their jacket's soaked from the inside. And they've sweat and lost all that water from their body. So I think
this is an area, though, like both the active insulation and the protective side here, where dialing it in for you in the field is really important because me and Brigham a lot of times are on the same level. Like we both sweat a lot. We both run maybe similar body temperature situations, but we will often see like Derek, from our team here, he'll hike a lot in a Ventus active hoodie. And I think I often look at him and think, man, if I was in a Ventus right now, I would be sweating like crazy. And sometimes I've kind of asked him, like, are you sweating? Are you not? And he just doesn't sweat as much and maybe runs a little bit colder temperature. And so he utilizes these same pieces just a little bit differently than maybe me and Brigham. But I think the big important part here is as you're in the field testing these for yourself, be very conscious of when you sweat. Typically, you will start to sweat before you can even consciously tell or notice. So being overly conscious of it is helpful. You won't catch it before you start sweating. You know what I mean? Like it's a reactive instead of proactive approach. Yeah. But as you're dialing it in, make sure that you're just being very conscious of that. Because like Brigham said, it just once you get layers wet, like that sucks. Now you've got a totally different problem to deal with. But two, like that is just, essential ingredients, I guess, to performing, which is to stay hydrated. The more water you have to carry, the heavier. Water is the heaviest thing in our packs 99% of the time. So just very interesting, but very interesting to, I guess, go through the process of dialing this in. Now, the last thing that you had said, and maybe this falls in a different category, though, is you'd kind of said like sun and mosquito protection even. Yeah. I want to hear what your thoughts are on those.
Well, that's where like the windbreaker, again, for this little 4-ounce jacket it's just a great benefit because a windbreaker doesn't wear off. It doesn't rub off and it's a lot easier to use than sunscreen. And you've already packed it in your pack and it doesn't weigh, you're not adding 3 ounces of sunscreen to it or sunscreen or bug spray. Bug spray is, to me, the more significant one because, I like hiking in bug spray, like to me it's almost.
Well, I have a new experience with it now after ruining a.
Oh, yeah.
Like I guess I hadn't used enough. I don't know. Basically, mosquito repellent that has DEET in it eats away at synthetic items, but particularly membranes on rain jackets, right?
Yeah.
For sure. And that's pretty much universal. I mean, you just get DEET onto a membrane, and it just starts wreaking havoc like crazy. Heck, I had the same bottle of DEET though leak in my truck. and it ate the plastic in my truck away.
Yeah, I've had it eat my watch band before.
Yeah, you'll see it like
stuff.
they'll destroy your watch bands, sometimes watch faces. It's incredibly harmful thing. So yeah, in my mind, I'm like, that's the last thing I want to have to use is freaking mosquito repellent anymore, because it just ruins anything it touches. And I'm sure it's great for your skin too.
Right.
Right. It can eat plastic.
Probably nothing harmful on there. But the definitely. I would say don't just not dismiss it. It's very helpful to consider, your clothing system as bug protection as well. And a rain and a wind jacket, the way it's designed to fit is like pretty trim and athletic, but it's not close to skin. So it's just this thin, tightly woven layer that generally, bugs, mosquitoes, especially, they can't really bite you through that. And it's a much more comfortable way of like protecting yourself from insects while protecting yourself from the sun. And it's so thin and lightweight that if you're sitting still, like say you get to camp and you're sitting still, like it's hardly retaining much heat, right? Because it's just this thin windbreaker and you're sitting still, you're not generating much heat. So it often, to me, is a more preferred method of bug protection. And then again, it offers like outstanding sun protection as well, especially like in the wintertime where you feel like if you're in conditions or locations where there's snow on the ground and it's a clear sunny day, you're going to have your sun's hitting you from all directions because it's bouncing off the snow and it's coming from, especially at high altitude, it's coming from the sky. And, oftentimes like just hiking in a base layer and a windbreaker is totally adequate because the sun is warm, but it's protecting your body from the sun at the same time. So
yeah, I want to put in a quick comment here that if any of you guys have questions about the stuff that we're talking about, there's two ways that you can ask those questions. And I actually want to start doing more question focused podcasts, maybe even quick 20, 30-minute episodes where we just answer our listeners' questions here. So two places that you can ask those would be, one, these episodes are now available on YouTube. So if you go over to YouTube and find this episode under the Live Ultralight podcast channel, you can add it in as a comment there, and then we can respond, or we can pull it into a future episode to respond. Or you can email us at liveultralightpodcast at gmail.com. Again, that's liveultralightpodcast at gmail.com. But if you've got questions as we go through this, maybe we go too fast or something, or you want a different story to explain some kind of principle, ask us those questions. Okay, we're on to the static section or category of this. So inside of the static, we've got the basically static insulation or lofted insulation, and then we've got the sleeping set. You've got top and bottom listed here. Now, I actually will say this, and this is probably, I want to ask this question as we go. Under this, lofted insulation, you just have lofted insulation jacket. No pants there, Brigham. What's up with that?
So that's because I didn't include the lofted pants because, again, this is for most of your time during the day or in daylight hours or the time that you're awake. Like we're moving to some degree. We're hiking. We're setting up camp, fairly active in that for most cases, like a pair of lofted insulation pants is like a little bit pretty safely outside the realm of necessity, especially assuming we have a tent with a sleeping bag or a quilt, where if we're static and we're sitting still in camp, we probably just get away with using that. There is, in the actual document that we've kind of referenced here, there is kind of a statement in there that says like this is for most active backpacking pursuits year round, but it will not cover all of the most like extreme cold weather instances, and there is the caveat that there can be like supplemental pieces added to this, and that is one that I would call that. So. I think
that makes a lot of sense for backpackers. I would say if you're someone who's listening that's more of a sportsman, hunter, something like that, there's going to be times where you're sitting stagnant outside of a shelter longer periods of time, rain, snow, whatever, wind, and so that would be a piece to consider in those conditions. And we did kind of skip over in that protective category the rain pants, but everything that we talked about applies to pants as well in my mind. Wind pants or rain pants can be used in the same way to reduce conductive heat loss. In fact, thinking back, one thing that I changed after our 2021 Uinta Highline attempt was, I started carrying wind pants or rain pants on a lot more conditions. Like wind pants, they're just so light, right? Like I think I've got a pair that's probably 3 ounces. And if it's cold and like I said, we got snowed on in August at high elevation, there's wind, there's stuff going on. Those wind pants, you're going to get wet in them. You're hiking in them anyways. You're going to be sweating to some degree, but you're just slowing down that heat getting ripped off your body so quickly. We talked a lot about like a windbreaker, and I think everyone's probably thinking more in terms of jackets, but the same does apply on the bottom half if you wanted to apply those same principles. Going back to this lofted insulation, I would say, for most backpackers, you do have that active or kinetic base layer bottom. So, layering that, I will put that on at camp at times. Maybe you want to sit out and eat outside your tent as a group or something like that, but it gets more chilly. And so I'll throw those long johns on or whatever you want to call them to sit around camp. No, they're not extremely warm. They're not a lofted insulation and whatnot, but they take that edge off. And for some reason, I don't know why, but our legs are typically just warmer, likely a lot more blood flow. You're using them. You're using them more, even around camp. Like even if you're just walking, you're probably using your arms and middle section of your body almost nothing. But there's still more likelihood to if you're using any muscle, it's going to be your legs first and foremost. So that has to play into it. But anyways, back to just static, like a puffy jacket in this layering system. That's basically the piece that our recommendation is. So for us, this would be something like our Nova line of jackets. So the Nova UL. If you were to take something like that, that's the piece that you're only using once you're stagnant. Otherwise, you're going to overheat in it. You're going to sweat in it. It's not built to be a breathable piece. In fact, you want it to basically be not a breathable piece if it's a static piece. Right. I think I think that's probably the easiest layer for people to just understand. You put this on to eliminate, that radiation heat loss.
When your body is only emitting what it would naturally emit, just sitting still, then you need to layer insulation up on top of it because you're not active enough to generate more heat. So then you need to throw on your lofted insulation, and and I would say this all depends on the seasonality or conditions, the temperature range, where you're at, but that. It could be that on the particular trail that you're on, you could stop for lunch and need to put on your static insulation piece because if it's you can be really warm moving down the trail in just your base layer top, just your hiking shirt. But if it's a little bit windy and 40 degrees, you're going to get cold real quick. So it's if you're going to stop for more than a few minutes in conditions that after a few minutes of sitting still, you're going to start shivering, just throw that lofted insulation on. That's the whole purpose of the static insulation.
It's so hard not to go down a rabbit hole here and talk about like in that scenario. If it's me or you going down the trail, we're sweating in those base layers, they're wet, and then throwing a down puffy over the top, you're like, oh no, don't get your down touching anything moisture or all that kind of stuff. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but that's probably a topic we should talk about for the future. I think there's some things to discuss there, but anyways, yes, use your insulations anytime you're stagnant that's needed. Retain that body heat and mitigate that heat loss. One other thing, just on going back to the bottom half there, I've had tremendous success using a base layer bottom, right, mixed with rain pants or wind pants too, because what I find, at least on my bottom half, is it's not so much about having a puffy on there. It's about having, some level of layers on there, and then just again stopping that airflow. A little bit of even like my Sawtooth pants, they're not like a puffy, right? But they also aren't something that completely blocks the wind. So that's where something like the rain or the wind pant is still going to block the wind a little bit better than a Sawtooth pant. And if you had any base layers underneath that, it really just compounds. And so the last 2 trips that we've done, actually, I've done that and been quite happy. I know I was more comfortable than the people around me, actually.
Yeah.
So,
Sure.
Okay, we're on to the last one here, which is another static layer, and you're calling it your sleeping set.
Yeah, I consider this just one piece, right? They might as well
onesie, man.
It might as well be a onesie.
The buttons on the butt flap.
If it was a onesie, it might be a little bit better, slightly less versatile, but maybe a little bit better. But I mean, in terms of the concept, it is a really lightweight, dry, comfortable set of clothes that are just for sleeping. Now, this is an adaptable clothing system. It is meant to be very versatile, and there's a lot of logic and practicality to counting your base layer top and bottom as your sleeping clothes. But to me, like, the most important part is that you've got a dry set of clothes to get into at night. It is absolutely feasible to sleep in damp, sweaty clothes and slowly dry those out throughout the night. But I consider this a pretty core piece of the clothing system, because sleep on multi-day like expeditions is one of your most important commodities or most important assets, is getting good sleep and recovery. And there have been trips that we've been on where we've gone to bed just wet from sweat and rain from taking layers off in between setting up a tent and things like that, where like we get into our tent pretty damp and wet and we just want to warm up real quick, and it gives such a boost of physical warmth and morale to just get into what I just take as basically my sleeping set is a base layer top and bottom. Really lightweight, like 4 ounces per piece, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And so it's a pretty critical piece.
I'd say it's probably like I'll give it the badge of it's the most satisfying piece of this system.
It's like the most luxurious.
It is, and it's only 4 to 8 ounces, that range depending on the base layers you choose. But at the end of the day, pulling off any kind of wet, sticky layer and pulling on like my favorite personally is like our Tern. I love sleeping in our Tern hoodie. Yeah. I love it. Like merino wool against the skin, it's lofted, it regulates super well. But like pulling that on at the end of the day it's amazing. Like it just instant warmth, instant comfort, like in all facets of those words. And so to me, I always am going to take, like the piece I'm hiking in the day and a piece I'm going to sleep in at night for that particular purpose. Now, do I want to dry stuff out sometimes? Sometimes I do. Yeah. I can still do that. I'm just going to put it in the sleeping bag with me or put it in the top quilt with me. It'll still get that chance to dry out. It just doesn't have to be next to my skin, potentially ruining any comfort that I could be having while sleeping. So it would dry a hair better, but most of the stuff that I use dries just fine because of my choices with what I'm selecting. It's going to dry just fine, even if it's not on my person. So
the other pretty important aspect of a dedicated sleeping set is that it protects your bag so much more, which is especially multi-day is actually really important. So it's one way where our clothing choices can affect other gear items, and our sleep system is it really is a system. So if you're sleeping in clean sleeping clothes, then your quilt or your sleeping bag is going to stay cleaner for longer. It's going to retain its loft a lot better. You're going to have to wash it less often. There's definitely some benefits there.
Yeah, I think that is a good one to point out. Okay, I think we're almost there here. One thing that I wanted to add is, so this is in written form in much more detail on our website. My recommendation is, like, unless you've got a lot of time to kill and you just want to go read, a big essay per se, what I would recommend is the next time you're shopping for a piece, go to the section on the website that talks about that specific piece, learn about that, and then use that to help you make a selection on the gear itself. This is a good principles overview. There's other facets such as, fabric choices, materials, weights, different things like that. And so let's say you are going to go shop for a base layer top, go find this layering system guide, go to the section on base layers and tops and just read those sections. And then allow that to help you make a choice on that particular area. I think that you'll get a lot of value in this. Yeah. We also plan to relay back to this as we talk about individual pieces, as we do gear loadouts here, and we explain why did we choose this piece versus this piece. This all falls under this, and so we'll likely reference this system quite a lot. But yes, this in great detail is available on the Outdoor Vitals website. So go to outdoorvitals.com. And under the, I think, Learn More or Explore tab, you'll be able to find a 10-piece layering system. And then you can click through that to find the specific areas that you might be looking for. So
yeah, that's a good point. It is, and it's not like just in this giant scroll down for 10 hours format. It's formatted really well where it's kind of broken into sections and you can navigate forward and back and skip to a link. For different pieces or categories, or a little bit of some contextual information. It's formatted in I think a really digestible way. Like you said, you could just go find a given piece and read about it and be on your way. So,
yep. Well, looking forward, Brigham. We've got winter upon us. It's been blowing like crazy and snowing out there. It even snowed on us on our last trip out there. So maybe we'll have to do a trip recap here soon, but we've got some exciting testing coming. We've got some, we're still doing quite a bit of testing on the product field on different things, but we'll try to share some of our insights as we get out in the field and do this, but hopefully you guys are doing the same. But any last words or comments as you look at the rest of, or as we get into winter here?
Winter's a really good time to test your own gear and your own clothing system, and oftentimes there's winter and cold weather is a more visible way of seeing how certain things work because there's more disparity between body temperature and the outside air. So it's kind of a cool time to test clothing because you can kind of see how things work. Sometimes you can see how breathable something is by if you start forming a crust of ice on the outside of the piece. That tells you it's pushing moisture through your body or through your system pretty well. It's fun.
I actually was just digging through old photos that I had on my phone. And so it was probably 3 or 4 years ago, I was hiking in a blizzard on the top of the mountain. And it was I was in a Loft-Tech jacket and I was sweating. And I took a picture because in one of the in the seams of the jacket, had all these curly little things. It looked like the insulation was bleeding through the jacket, but instead it was just moisture that was pushing away from my body and coming out. And it was a really, really cool thing. Thinking back now, I might have been hiking in the wrong peaks. Obviously, I was developing a little too much moisture. And but it is a great time to get out there, test, and figure out your own stuff. So. Okay, well, with that, I already mentioned how you can leave us a comment on YouTube, or you can email us directly at liveultralightpodcast@gmail.com. If you've yet to review the podcast, please go review it on iTunes or your whatever podcasting app you're listening to. That helps us get in front of more people and accomplish our purpose of helping more people get outside more comfortably and more confidently. We know that helps people both physically, mentally, emotionally, and everything. In this day and age, it's more important than ever. So go do that for us. We'd really appreciate it. Make sure you're subscribed, and we'll see you on a future podcast.